Hello. In these next two modules, we're going to be going over stabilization of the business cycle. And this module will be about fiscal policy, and the next one, part two, will be concentrated on monetary policy. So now, think about the economy here. And where we are in the economy with output and inflation depends on those aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. But these curves aren't just stagnant. They're always moving around a little bit. The aggregate demand curve is bouncing around a little bit, and the aggregate supply curve is bouncing around too, like this. Both of them are moving, and that equilibrium is always changing. Now, most economists think that we go into a recession like Keynes thought, probably because there's a lack of aggregate demand in the economy. So this aggregate demand curve is bouncing around, and sometimes it just takes a big downward whoosh out of nowhere. No one expected it, referred to as a black swan. And we end up in maybe a recession from some decrease in aggregate spending by people and businessmen. Now, if there is a downturn like that in the economy suddenly, a couple of things might happen. One is it might just stay down for a while, and we end up in this recession for a while. The other is that it might just bounce back up to where it was before without anyone doing anything about it, just the economy getting back to where it was before. But if it pops down and it stays down, then we might want to think about doing something about it, have the government step in to increase aggregate demand, like Keynes thought. The solution was increase aggregate demand to get us back to where we were. So that's what we'll be going through today, is the stabilization, and we'll concentrate, as I said, mainly on fiscal policy in this module. So our outline for this module is we'll go through the different types of stabilization, which is fiscal policy and monetary policy. And we'll take a look at what the people before Keynes, the economists before Keynes, before the 1930s, thought about this kind of thing, stabilization policy. Then we'll look through fiscal policy in the short run, show how it can be contractionary or expansionary. Then we'll go through fiscal policy in the long run. Then we'll go through how the government finances spending. So if we're going to increase government spending to try to stimulate aggregate demand, where's that money come from? And then we'll take a quick look at fiscal policy during the last few recessions and what some of the problems are with it. And then we'll take a look at what supply side economics is, or what the supply siders think about fiscal policy. Okay, so we have this business cycle where over time, GDP is fluctuating. So it's going up and down, and hopefully over time it moves upward. And what we want to do is stabilize that business cycle. Rather than these peaks and valleys, we want to have a GDP that moves more like this, on a steady path up without these ups and downs. Now we can look at the business cycle with Keynesian economics, our model, where we have inflation on the vertical axis and GDP on the horizontal axis. And we've got a downward sloping aggregate demand and an upward sloping aggregate supply. And we've got a vertical aggregate supply curve in the long run. And if we're at long run equilibrium, then that short run aggregate supply curve will have to pass through this point. So suppose we're at this long run equilibrium and we're also at a short run equilibrium with full employment at potential output. And there's some shock to the economy. There's some shock to aggregate demand. So we can look at that as a decrease here to the left of the aggregate demand curve. And we'll say we were at point A, and we know that in the short run here, we will move quickly to a new equilibrium. We'll call it point B, and the inflation rate might be a little bit lower and output will be less. So this would be some sort of downturn here in the business cycle. And as I said, one of two possible things might occur. Maybe it'll be just a temporary, short-term, temporary shock, negative shock to the economy, and aggregate demand will go back to what it was. So this aggregate demand shock might have been, say, from a stock market fall, a big stock market fall, which influences wealth and influences consumption, and people slow down on their spending. Well, it might be just a temporary thing because maybe in a few weeks or a month, the stock market will go back to where it was before, and people's wealth will go back to where they were before, and we'll go back to point A on its own. But what happens if that aggregate demand curve shifts down to the left? There's this negative shock to the economy, and we stay down. Now, we know what's going to happen, that eventually, may take some time, but eventually we'll get back to full employment. This green, we'll call this point C, so that we'll move to point A to B fairly quickly. And then slowly over time, if nothing's done, we'll eventually get back to full employment at point C. And that aggregate supply curve will slowly shift down until we get to point C. And the result will be a lower inflation rate, but the same potential. Now, we're not sure exactly which path was going to happen here. And we don't know really how long it'll take to get from point B to C. Depends how long it takes that aggregate supply curve to shift downward. Now, the 1930s, during the Depression, was a time when there really was no active stabilization in the economy. So there was nothing done with fiscal policy or monetary policy to get back to where we were before at full employment. The market eventually got back to its own, full employment, their point C on its own, but it took some time. So it took 1929 till early 1940s when World War II picked up before that depression was over. So we don't have very many data points to look at, but here's one data point where there was no stabilization policy, and it took about 13 years to get back to full employment. So two types of stabilization policies. There's fiscal policy and monetary policy. Now, fiscal policy is done by taxing and spending. So we have taxing and spending, which we can write as either T or G, government spending and government taxing. And this is done by Congress and the president. Congress makes the laws and the president signs them. Monetary policy, on the other hand, is stabilizing the economy by changing the money supply. So over here is changing the money supply. I'll write that with just M sub S. And this is done by the Federal Reserve. So Congress and the president don't conduct monetary policy, although they try to influence it. And the Federal Reserve doesn't conduct fiscal policy, although they will make their comments about it and make suggestions about what Congress and the president should be doing with their fiscal policy, which isn't surprising. Everybody wants to tell everybody else what to do. Now, before Keynes, this pre-Keynesian thinking was that neither one of these things would really have an effect on the economy. So neither would have an effect. In effect. The thinking was that, well, when it came to monetary policy, money was neutral. So money was neutral. So changing the money supply wouldn't have any effect on output. It would only change prices in the economy. And the thinking was if when it came to government spending, that if the government started spending more money, then people would spend less. Consumption would fall by the same amount. And so overall, it wouldn't change anything in the economy. Now, Keynes wasn't the only one to think that, you know, fiscal policy and monetary policy might have an effect on the economy. But he's the only one that really came up with a nice explanation and model as to how it would have an effect on the economy. Keynes thought that both of these stabilization policies would work, but there might be times when monetary policy wouldn't work and it might create a lot of inflation. And so without having any data to look at, he thought fiscal policy would be the way to go because it would always work. But really what he said was the economy just needs aggregate demand to increase. And both of these things would probably do it. So let's take a look at fiscal policy in the short run. We can think of it as either being expansionary or contractionary. So expansionary fiscal policy is going to be, you know, increasing government spending or lowering taxes or both. And it's thought that it's going to increase aggregate demand and shift that aggregate demand curve to the right. Contractionary fiscal policy would be just the opposite. It would be a big decrease in government spending or increasing taxes or doing both, and that would shift aggregate demand to the left. So let's take a look at the curves here and go through an example of fiscal policy. If there's what's called a recessionary gap, or sometimes referred to as an output gap, where our output is Y here, is less than potential. So over here is potential, and we've got some sort of equilibrium between the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves, these short curves, that are putting us at an output something less than full employment. So in the context of expansionary fiscal policy, you remember aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus net exports. An increase in government spending or lowering taxes will shift this aggregate demand curve to the right. G goes up or T falls, and we have a new equilibrium. And you can see that that new equilibrium has a higher level of output and might also have a higher level of inflation too, depending on how steep that aggregate supply curve is. It's also possible that output might increase more than the amount of government spending. So if it does, then that's referred to as the Keynesian multiplier or the spending multiplier. The Keynesian multiplier. That Y, or output, may increase by some multiple of G. So Keynes was thinking, if you spend $1 billion here in the economy on government spending, it might increase output by 10 billion, maybe 5 or 10 times as much as what the spending is. He didn't have any data to look at, though, of course. It was all just theoretical. It turns out that most likely increasing government spending or lowering taxes does increase output, but it's nowhere near what Keynes thought it might be. The actual multiplier, the Keynesian spending multiplier, is probably more like 1. So for every $1 billion, every $1 trillion spent on government spending, it might increase GDP by 1 trillion also. Now, it's important to know what that multiplier is, because if we go into a recession and we look at nominal GDP and say, well, nominal GDP fell by $1.5 trillion in the last 2 quarters, that might give us an estimate of what we need to increase G by. We might have to increase G also by $1.5 trillion. So expansionary fiscal policy moves aggregate demand to the right. Contractionary fiscal policy would be just the opposite. That would be moving aggregate demand to the left, or shift it to the left. But contractionary fiscal policy is not very common. Usually, decreases in government spending are political, and it's done because there's usually a party that wants to cut down on our government spending. It's not because the economy is doing so well that we want to increase aggregate demand. That would not be politically popular. So an example of some contractionary fiscal policy that had an effect on the economy would be when the Korean War ended. At the end of the Korean War, government spending dropped, aggregate demand fell, and it did cause a recession in this country. But it's hard to say, is it going to cause a recession or not at the end of a war? Many economists predicted recessions at the end of World War II because they thought all this government spending would stop, shift aggregate demand to the left, we'd have another recession. It didn't happen, and they all ended up having egg on their face for predicting a recession that never came about. The economy actually did very well right after World War II. So something else must have kicked in. Even though government spending slowed down, consumption or investment must have increased by enough to make up for it, or even more than make up for it. Okay, now what about fiscal policy in the long run? So we'll use our same model, but we'll use the long run aggregate supply curve. If we want to know what's going to happen in the long run, here's aggregate demand, here's potential, here's inflation. Now, in the long run, if we were to increase aggregate demand with using fiscal policy, increase government spending, you can see the only result here is that inflation will increase. In the long run, we're going to be at potential output regardless. And if we were to decrease aggregate demand, same thing. In the long run, it just changes the inflation rate, but won't change GDP. So stimulating the economy is just, it's only effective in the short run. But that's all we really want it for anyway, is in the short run to counteract a downturn in the business cycle. Okay, so what we've done in this video is we've gone through the different types of stabilization policies, fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is done by the president and Congress by changing spending, government spending and taxes. Monetary policy is done by the FOMC at the Federal Reserve by changing the money supply and interest rates. We've looked at fiscal policy in the short run as being either contractionary or expansionary by whether it increases the aggregate demand curve to the right or whether it decreases it and shifts it to the left. In the long run, we have an effect on output and inflation. Excuse me, in the short run, we have an increase, a change to inflation and output. But in the long run, the only effect of changing taxes and government spending is fiscal policy, is to change the inflation rate. But in the long run, it's not going to change potential output or full employment.